So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest in our View from the Bridge series entitled The Internet, Creator or Destroyer of Reputations. Given the topic, you won't be surprised to see that we have a Twitter wall on the screen, and the hashtag is #VFTB, so get tweeting. For those of you who are regulars at our events, you may be disappointed to see me chairing them rather than the very talented Mr. Jason Nissi, but I'll do my very best, and we have some really excellent speakers. So let me introduce John Rigby, who's the Director of Cyber at Alex Partners, the global advisory firm. Prior to joining Alex Partners, he was Director for Cyber, Intelligence and Information Integration at the MOD's Joint Forces Command.
Well done.
Now go and lie down.
That's why you abbreviate everything.
Dave King is the CEO and founder of Digitalis, one of the UK's leading, if not the leading, online reputation and digital intelligence firm. And Jason Beer QC from 5 Essex Court Chambers specialises in public law. He recently acted for the UK law enforcement agencies in the litigation arising from the theft by Edward Snowden from the US National Security Agency. And I think if any of you saw Edward Snowden on Panorama, you'll all be switching your smartphones off. And he also acted for the Metropolitan Police in the claims by the victims of phone hacking conducted by the News of the World and the Sunday Mirror. So we're very fortunate to have such a talented group of speakers. So the UK government estimates that 90% of large organisations and 74% of small businesses have suffered a cyber breach of security in the past year, and now classes cyber attack as a serious threat to the UK's national security. And I'm sure since the summer we've all read about Carphone losing 2.4 million customers' data. There was the 5.6 million fingerprints that were stolen from the US government. Very embarrassing. And something that is a source of great joy for divorce lawyers across the world, the hack of Ashley Madison. So never mind the cost of putting all of this right, which runs into millions. Think of the loss of trust, the loss of brand of reputation, and the loss of brand value. That could well be incalculable. So Ed Vaizey, who is the Minister for Digital Economy, many of us didn't know we had a Minister for the Digital Economy, but we do, wants the UK to be the safest place to do business online in the world. Can that actually be achieved? So let's ask our speakers. John, over to you.
So in a PR firm, the answer is probably yes and no. So there's two components to the question, I think, which are quite important. The first is the safety, and the second is doing business. If you're going to do business online or in the digital age, you have to take risk. And so you can't be completely safe as a consequence of the means that you choose to do business with. And so deciding on the balance between the two is really critical. So, for example, if you want to take rewarded risk by cutting cost out by going into cloud computing, which a lot of firms need to do, you've got to make sure that in doing so, you're not opening yourself up to data breach. You are managing the relationship with your provider hands-on, and you're actually exchanging data. So taking it from the perspective of rewarded risk is really critical. In terms of the UK government, it was taken, when I was in government, it was taken really, really seriously by the senior leadership. £1 billion was invested over 4 years as new money in the last government, and I would expect similar to be invested this year once the defence review and the spending review has taken place. I think the early focus from the government was on creating a baseline secure cyber environment, hence the 10 steps and the education programme. I think the next stage is going to be really interesting. Having done the basics, where does the government go next? How does they encourage us to move forward? And finally, and I think it's connected to that previous point, if we are going to meet Ed Vaizey's aspirations, we've got to work out where the delineator between public responsibility and private responsibility lies, and resource it appropriately. So somewhere or other, when a cybercrime has been committed, it's the responsibility of the law enforcement agents to take it over and to run it to ground and to get the money back of whatever crime is being committed. Equally, it's the responsibility of boards to make sure that they have protected their assets, their data assets and their shareholders' value as much as they can. Now, I don't think that boundary has yet been decided or debated, and I think in that grey area, that, and we'll perhaps come back to this later, is where an understanding of whose reputation is at stake and who is responsible, and thus protecting the reputation of the private sector organisation.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Deborah. Before I answer your question, Deborah, I might just, thank you for the introduction. I might just mention that on the Ashley Madison hack that Deborah referred to, we cross-referenced this morning all the data from the Ashley Madison hack with your attendee list this morning, and there's only 7 people in the room whose names came up. Shall I wait until the end to disclose the... if anyone wants to leave now, it won't look at all suspicious. No, I'm slightly surprised, Deborah, to hear Ed Vaizey say, something so broad and arguably meaningless as making Britain the most secure place in internet commerce. We hosted a lunch recently with Ed Vaizey, a private lunch where we talked with some industry leaders about some of the issues with doing anything on a country-specific basis online, because of course the internet by definition doesn't have boundaries and what have you, and that presents issues, and I'm sure Jason will touch on some of the jurisdictional challenges that brings up. But I think the big challenge with trying to fix this cyber issue is some of the misconceptions at the board table. And what I thought I'd just touch on briefly is make a few observations about how cyber is increasingly considered at the FTSE board or the family office board table, but how it's so often misunderstood. And then I thought I'd touch briefly on the human aspect, which is so important if we're going to get anywhere near what Ed wants to achieve, whether on a country basis or on a world basis. I think it's fair to say that media awareness of cyber issues, you mentioned several recent high-profile attacks, media awareness is significant, and that means that the board, the chief executive, has at last woken up to the idea that he or she needs to be scared about something, even if they're not entirely clear what that something is. We see 2 big misconceptions, though. First, we see that given that a lot of the media coverage of hacks, given that a lot of the reported hacks relate to the theft of consumer data, we see a lot of people who sit in businesses which don't hold consumer data thinking this isn't about us. So because, and in fact every hack you just mentioned, Deborah, related to consumer data. Verizon estimate that 20% of hacks relate to IP. And I'm sure John in due course will talk about some of the state-sponsored and other corporate espionage hacks that go on. So it's not just about consumer data. So whether we're talking to a hedge fund whose entire EV is based on their proprietary trading algorithm, or to a pharmaceuticals firm whose pre-patent design prototypes sit on an engineer's laptop in his apartment in London, or whatever it might be, the key thing that boards need to understand is this is about all of us. The second thing that CEOs tend to miss is that CEOs think of cyber as a purely technical issue. And what that means is it tends to be managed strategically outside of the board by a head of technology. The communication between that head of technology and CEO is fundamentally flawed because the tech guy will use a lot of jargon the CEO doesn't actually understand. And our view is that the CTO who sees this as a tech-only issue and the CEO whose measure of risk is asking the CTO whether the network is secure is completely missing the point, because the vast majority of bespoke, dedicated attacks, which is really what we're all worried about, start today with social engineering. That is, using information that's out there about you, your colleagues, your business partners, your employees, your wives, husbands, and teenage children to try and engineer their way into the inbox. A recent Red Team assessment for a major UK bank used the data that was out there about senior executives to try and create a phishing email to penetrate the inbox and install malware on machines. And it was a bank-sponsored initiative to find out how aware their senior execs were. And the red team used 20 senior execs who'd posted a load of data about their marathon performance, talking about their employer, the charity whom they were sponsoring as a result of it, their marathon performance and their team performance. And these emails were very, very carefully crafted to be bespoke in each and every case, to congratulate them on their specific marathon time. It was co-branded with the bank and the charity they'd supported and what have you. 18 out of 20 senior bank execs clicked on the link, malware was successfully installed, and red team was into the system. That's why we see the problem as being human, not technical. And the olden days of that Nigerian phishing email that told you you've inherited $80 million from an uncle you never knew you had are long gone, you know. I think if you look at some of those recent high-profile attacks, the Target hack in the US, where 40 million consumer credit card details were stolen, it transpires that started with social engineering and a single phishing email into the ventilation and heating supplier, who were a third-party supplier. You know, Target had spent $1.6 million months before on a network protection system. They had a team in India who were monitoring network traffic. They actually picked up on some of the spikes, but this team got in through a supplier who had a small window into the IT network. They sat there for 2 weeks silently before hitting, and that's cost Target $150 million. It's been widely reported, huge attack. The Sony attack started with LinkedIn research into which executives in that organization had administrator privileges. And the Apple hack, I love the Apple hack because that is not even a hack. You know, the media loves the word hack. You know, actually, the Apple hack did not compromise Apple's technology at all. You know, the Apple hack, which was where celebrities' photographs were stolen from their iCloud accounts, and the media said, oh my God, Apple's been hacked, is Apple compromised, and so on and so forth. Actually, what that was an initiative which relied on the fact that most users don't use the two-stage authentication that Apple provides. Most users' passwords are readily memorable things. And as with many of the media hacking cases, Jason, that you've dealt with, this relied on going out, finding public information, dates of birth, mothers' maiden names from Wikipedia and social media profiles, and trying them until they got access. So I think there are big problems. You know, I think it's a bold statement saying, can we make the UK the most secure place online for trading? I think the answer is no, because there are no geographical boundaries. If we're going to make the area of online as safe as possible, I think some of the considerations we all need to start taking account of are human, almost before technical.
Thanks for the question, Deborah. I think the answer is yes, of course, we can make it the safest place, because the government have said that it will be the safest place in its cybersecurity policy, and if it's in writing, then it's true. I would say, from a lawyer's perspective, don't rely on me or my colleagues. The law provides largely an after-the-event remedy rather than a prevention tool. You're better off relying on the two guys, John and Dave, sitting next to me, and the services that they offer to prevent rather than cure attacks. And thirdly, I would say that given the asymmetric nature of the threat involved, it's probably unlikely, given what's on the horizon, that the current policy adopted by HMG is flexible and fleet of foot enough to deal with the threat as it is emerging. I just want to touch for a few moments on the threats that are emerging, the trends of perhaps the next couple of years. Firstly, the Internet of Things. This is a focus of research, investment, and indeed quite a lot of hype. But we're seeing quite a lot of proof of concept hacks emerging relating to such humble things as refrigerators, thermostats, and cars. However, the threat from IoT is likely to occur mainly in a business environment rather than the consumer level. Manufacturing and industrial environments in particular are likely to see an increase in attack volume. So things like bridges, roads, power plants and airports, all increasingly connected with large control systems that are automated. This adds a further level of threat, a further threat surface for cyber criminals. Secondly, cyber espionage. The techniques and tactics of nation-state cyber espionage have primarily been successful. Therefore, other countries are likely to want to develop their cyber espionage plans. And it seems likely that we'll see an increase in loosely affiliated cells that conduct cyber initiatives, independent from, but in support of nation-state causes, in particular from countries with high economic forecasted growth. They're likely to be the next to engage in cyber espionage activities to protect and advance their growing affluence. And this is likely to involve more state to private sector attacks rather than the traditional state to state espionage. Third, an increasing focus on retail. With billions there for the taking, cyber attacks against retail companies are likely to increase. Equally, as the retail sector increases its defences with increasing security measures, cyber criminals are likely to wish to accelerate the pace of their credit card data theft and fine-tune their malware. Fourthly, mobile attacks. We increasingly rely on smartphones as authentication measures. The auto-logging capability of mobile apps perhaps offers a wider open goal for cyber criminals. Fifth, the use of old source code. This is just waiting to be exploited. It's likely that the treasure trove of data available sitting behind the code is likely to be publicly available on cloud storage sites through the hacking of old code foundations. And lastly, endpoint security. More recent activity has been around network security, but the pendulum seems to be swinging back so that endpoint security is a focus of some of the smartest minds in the business. As I say, given the asymmetric nature of the threat, the range of actors involved, the motives that each of them may have, the variety of threats available, and the harm that might be done, the list that I provided is likely to be partial and incomplete. The solutions to it are down to professionals like John and Dave.
Thank you. Well, I guess all of those cases that we've talked about are just the tip of the iceberg, aren't there? There are so many more that never see the light of day. What do you think about the recent changes in consumer legislation that the government's put in, which does that enable individuals to actually take legal action against the companies that may have lost their data and cause them loss?
Yes.
Right.
And I think it's always been the case that it has. I don't
Right.
think any recent changes in consumer protection legislation have required it or enabled it. It's been the case, and I suspect what's on the horizon for the UK is a much more class-based approach. We've seen it in the States, class actions joining together. You'll start getting emails and phone calls saying, has your data been lost? The PPI, from somebody in Liverpool saying, have you lost your PPI? So I think it's likely that in the future we're going to see what's happened in the States with some very big class actions, talking about tens of million dollars being lost in real money, not just reputational brand loyalty gone, in real money. There's been 2 or 3 suits in the United States where the awards of damages have been $100 million, $200 million.
Wow. So it seems that no matter what companies do, the people who want to, that we're always one step ahead of the people who want to take action against companies. So what can actually be done? So
first of all, I think that's a really good question, because all too often the scare stories are what we learn and listen to, rather than saying, right, it's there, it's real, how do we sort it out? So I think there are three layers of things that can be done. The first, which plays towards your point on the personnel side, is to ensure that you're not vulnerable from theft from your workforce or your partners. There are measures in place, whether it's HR security, whether it's access management, a mix of technical policy and people measures to fix that. It is reasonable to expect a board to fix that. Then there's doing the basics and essentials to stop the teenager in the bedroom, or a drive-by, or a low-tech known threat from damaging you. And again, it's reasonable because the data's there, the information's there, the costings are there for a board to do that. Then you get into a zone, and this is all backed up by regulation thus far. Then you get into a zone where there is a leakage of capability from nation states into the criminal fraternity, the advanced persistent threats. And the average time for an advanced persistent threat to be discovered on a standard network is 200 days. So there's got to be an assumption that you are going to be subjected to an APT. Now, nation states can't afford to keep APTs out. So I think the question is around its mitigation. It goes from doing something actively to stop it happening to then being in a situation where, if it has happened and you've been unlucky, then you've got to handle that from the reputational risk perspective. And that's why this is a really interesting forum, and that's why this is not just about doing things technically. It's also about recognising it's going to happen and then using the skills that are in this room to actually handle the reputational damage afterwards.
I might add something, if I may, Deborah, on the mitigation side of things. I was involved in another conference session the other day on this very topic, and when we all finished talking, somebody put their hand up and said, "So what you're saying is we're all screwed, and there's nothing we can do. So why bother?" And I thought, well, actually, it's a really poignant question. Actually, a very clever question, and I think actually, the truth is. John alludes to some of the logical mitigations that, of course, we all should be putting in place, and some of them are technical and some of them are human. I think ultimately, the analogy to my mind is security in the home. If you've got a little bit to protect, you might put a burglar alarm on your home. If you've got a little bit more money to spend, you might put infrared sensors on the windows and heat maps on the floor. And as you move up, having more and more to protect and more money to protect it, you might have, snipers on the roof, a helicopter floating, and whatever else. You vet all your house staff and all this kind of stuff. And in reality, it's no different in online and cyber mitigation, because there is no end to the amount of money that can be spent. And ultimately, if the attacker is dedicated and resourced, they're going to get through the next level of security. So I think one thing's for sure is we are all going to spend a lot more money on cyber protection. I think we've all got to learn that it's human, not technical. But yes, there is always a remaining vulnerability. And I think part of the challenge in offsetting legal claims in negligence is being able to demonstrate that reasonable measures and beyond have been taken. The other point I'd make is on the reputational fallout of some of these things, and I see a slight tide change here, because 5 years ago we used to say that if in the olden days, if the bank was broken into, armed robbery at the bank, nobody blamed the bank, they blamed the robbers. And yet, early on in cyber breaches, when if Barclays was hacked, consumers and the media blamed Barclays for their failure in systems. And I think that's definitely still the case. Target, Apple, Sony, they're all under fire, and of course there's a reputational fallout. But I think, again, as we all become more educated, as the media hopefully becomes more educated, as consumers become more educated, we realise that this is a risk of life and a fact of life. So the reputational challenges will change, I think.
Okay, so this is the new fact of life. Can I ask for questions from the audience? Stephen.
Is it the case that there are some business models that are just now completely broken? Ashley Madison is a business model that would never have existed before the internet because you couldn't be quite that secretive without the online presence with what you need to do to use that service. That business model is surely now completely dead.
I bet it isn't. I bet it isn't. I mean, look, I think there's no doubt that at a consumer level, at a high street level, of course, people have woken up now to the risk of that. I mean, I'm slightly staggered. I mean, even if I had been inclined to use that kind of service, I'd never have trusted a third-party entity with my data. Now, I think at the consumer level, we've got, when I walk into Starbucks and buy my coffee, and the guy at the till says to me, "Oh, you've got to register and switch your app on because then you can get free coffee." And I think, I trust you guys to make me a coffee. I'm not sure I trust you to have access to my travel data, my whereabouts, and various other pieces of personal data. But that's because I'm a paranoid being. I think consumers generally do still. And I think things like Ashley Madison change our thresholds there. And, the sad thing is we should all be incredibly paranoid and a lot more paranoid than we are about this kind of stuff. Will it break the model? No. I think it'll create new models. So if you think of the fact that, there are huge businesses already built up around hiding your steps online. And they don't hide your steps online. I mean, again, dependent on, there are lots of cases of some of these proxy IP companies having had to disclose the identity of users in court, dependent on their whereabouts and what have you. But there's also these things coming into existence, and it's a little bit like the reputational attack that we deal with in our business, where someone's viciously attacked online. Now, normally, those attacks aren't sophisticated, and we, with the help of lawyers, we can find out who those people are. But if you asked me to create an anonymous attack of somebody online, such that you couldn't find out who I was, I could. And I think that the reality is we'll see new business, like the proxy IP things, Hide My Ass. You've heard of companies like Hide My Ass and Foxy Proxy who cover your steps online. I think it'll be exactly that for proxies, so that I can be anonymous and use those kinds of services. Not me personally, of course. The seven of you.
Now you know.
So I think what will kill a business model, and I agree with you. I think it's not going to go back in the boxes. Is trust, and I think there is the trust of the generations and the individuals who use these sorts of things. And my kids are very trusting of it, too trusting of it. And I think then there's the trust of the market. And what you saw with Ashley Madison was pretty well, its business model, its aspirations were destroyed because it lost the trust of the market, because it lost the trust of people, because I would offer it wasn't looking after its data properly, and it didn't get the PR sorted out, as it probably couldn't, to be honest, but had it been possible, it didn't do that. So there were 3 or 4 steps on that route that it could have intervened and actively done stuff to actually preserve its business model. So it wasn't the business model was wrong, they hadn't managed the risk associated with the business model appropriately. And you know what, I've only been in the commercial world for 4 months, I see it all the time. And it ties to what you guys were saying about the board really understanding the connection between the business model, the operating cost, the cap value, and the associated cyber risk, and the communication between the two halves.
I agree with John and Dave. I don't see it as that business model being shot. It's likely to continue, but represent an opportunity for other businesses using a similar model to market, as you say, more secure facilities and trade on people's trust.
Any more questions?
From my experience, I think one of the issues is it's not just the fact that managing the fences to the data. The problem is just the ability to walk into a company and have access to all of the data. In 25 years ago, the intellectual knowledge of a business was contained in 1,000 filing cabinets and 1,000 files. And in my business's case, we recruited a senior executive of one of our competitors, and they got a court order to gain access to our systems. Not in the UK, where even if you're a terrorist, you couldn't do what they did, but in Holland, it's very easy. And they took a complete image of all our email for the previous 6 months, and I didn't realise that such a thing was possible. but it was so quick we didn't even have the legal things to stop it. And I think the problem is that people with administrative privileges that are trusted people, you have no doubt about their ability to protect the systems of your company. But if the law comes along and forces somebody to give access, it's a real problem. And you know, we ended up in a legal thing for over a year to fight these guys not being able to get access to our data, which we won, but it cost us a lot of money and wasted a hell of a lot of management time. And that was, you know, in a situation where I think our systems were fairly good, but effectively somebody forced their way through the front door and just had the locks opened over the law. So I think the problem, as much as anything, is the ability is actually to compartmentalise and protect the data within, so that you can't just, you know, from one country take 20 countries worth, in our case, of data all across the world. They were able to get it all because all our email was in the cloud. You know, it was a sort of thought that it was a threat we never even thought about.
So yeah, I was in previous existence tied to a degree with fixing some of the things that went wrong pre and post Snowden. So I, you know, I recognise that from the government side. And of course the guidance says that you should segment your network, you should segment your data, and you should protect, you know, put the most protection around your core assets.
But the problem is that when somebody breaks into, you know, Microsoft 365, you know, we have databases that are very well protected, but all the data's in the email inbox and outbox of everybody in your company. You know, just having an image of that, you've got everything.
Yeah. And you're right, it's impossible to protect the volume of data that underpins a business.
Take an image in this case 12 hours of the whole company.
So and it's that aggregation of data that is potentially damaging.
Yeah,
What you can do is you can make sure that the individuals within the firm that have access to the privileged users are reduced from, generally speaking, the 200 or 300 in the larger firms to 20 to 30. That's possible. You can segment the networks, and for those crown jewels, then you can protect them. But boy, is that easier said than done, particularly when you're talking about the aggregation of retail data. So I recognise that's a problem. And I also recognise that the legal framework has yet to settle down nationally and internationally to make it easy for businesses to do. There is no norm yet in the legal world, and actually I probably ought to stop talking about law at that point.
No, I mean, you're exactly right, that there isn't an overarching framework at the international plane, other than at treaty level, non-enforceable by individuals against states, that regulates sort of a set of normative behaviour. We've got a patchwork quilt of laws in this country, and there are quite a few holes in the patchwork.
I think your question also, it raises some other interesting points about data access and who's got what access. I mean, your point about the disclosure in a legal context is hard to preclude, although it does raise the question of the balance that a lot of organisations face now between data retention and the vulnerability that comes from access. You know, and we've spoken to clients recently who, you know, concerned about subject access requests that private individuals might be able to make, which obliges them to disclose any and all data they hold on a particular person, and which might include other matters, you know. And of course the instinct then is, well, we can shrink that, we can delete data, we can delete old data, but of course what if we need access to it? And I had a fascinating conversation with a client recently who said, well, what we've done is we've implemented a formal data deletion policy. So then when we get a subject access request, we can say that data no longer exists. And he said to me, well, it does really. We've got it on a completely separate system in case we need it, you know. It's like, but you can understand why he's come to that position, you know, staggering. But I think apart from the kind of legal disclosure issue that you faced, I think people having individual access to all that data is the challenge. And the challenge most organisations face is that they've got more access points by more users, using more devices which operate on more operating systems, some of whom are internal, some of whom are external. And it means that, you know, the employee theft of data is very real, you know, so the direct threat of employee theft. But of course, it's these people as well who typically open the door to an attacker, and the more of those people there are who've got access, the more vulnerable we are outside of the legal context. So we're all screwed.
Can I follow on to the point that we're all screwed and say, does it actually matter? I mean, I get the fact that there are actual money losses to be made here, but from a reputational point of view, does it matter? I ask that because look at the last kind of big scandals we've had have been about in the banking sector, LIBOR crisis. You ask consumers which banks did it, and they will broadly go, well, they're all guilty. So from a reputational point of view, does it matter from an individual business's point of view? Because won't consumers kind of go, oh, well, we're screwed anyway. So from a reputational point of view, it's kind of irrelevant.
I think it's probably worth differentiating. I think it's a great question. It's probably worth differentiating sectoral reputational challenges like PPI, like LIBOR, where a number of financial institutions were involved. Shame for those who weren't, because you're right. I think on the street, the reputational perception on the street of bankers has changed just as it has for politicians. Actually, they're all in it together. Is the kind of perception. But I think if you put that against something like BP, you've got a very different position. Compare that to Ashley Madison, and if we were inside at Ashley Madison right now, I think we'd find sign-ups have dropped significantly. I think there's a very real revenue cost, and I think the status quo is they've still postponed their much anticipated float. So yes, it really matters, dependent on the business type. I mean, if a pharmaceuticals firm's invested $4 billion in a new set of drugs, and the IP relating to those drugs is stolen by a foreign territory, that matters a great deal. So I think it's case by case, but yes, absolutely. So we're all screwed, and it really matters.
Yeah, I think there are two time curves on this. One is managing the first couple of news cycles, and I think if you manage the first couple of news cycles with confidence, and you say, look, put your hands up, and it's happened, and we're making amends, and we're in the process of working out what we should pay people or whatever, then your reputation, I think, is probably preserved. Then you've got these kind of exponential tail off where people will forget. But if something big is happening in your firm around that news cycle period, and you lose the trust and reputation of the client base, then I think that will probably kill you. I think the big banks are well established, and that's unlikely to happen. But if you're a startup or you've got a new business model, I think that's when it's going to damage you. And I think investing in working out what happens and being practiced for what happens when it does go wrong is absolutely the best way to almost red team what goes wrong on day zero when you get hit, and what do you say, and getting the CEO out to manage that reputational risk and that messaging.
And I think there's enough risk from, as I say, real money being lost. Look at the Chrysler Fiat issue in the States, where they had a hack on into the chip of a car. They had to do a product recall, cost over $100 million for the product recall. So I mean, as I said, that's real money because of a hack, not just reputational harm, brand damage.
I wanted to go back to where John started, actually, around the blurred boundaries between responsibility, and to get the panel's view on how we fix that then, and where responsibility should lie, because there's company responsibility, there's government responsibility, but then there's all the other suppliers and service providers linking to a company. Where does responsibility lie for them, making sure they're cyber secure?
I was at a conference recently where the concept of cyber justice came up. And I'll explain what I was told, and then perhaps someone can explain it to me. And it was around a legal framework, an enforceable legal framework, therefore capacity in law enforcement, and the will of the governing body, whoever you might deem that governing body to be, in an international, with an international resource like the internet, to ensure that there's justice on the internet. And I think we're a long way away, because wherever you go, there isn't sufficient capacity or will or tools to make that happen. And so I think boards have got to recognise that they have the responsibility in the absence of anything else around, and to make sure that they assess their risk and work out how they're mitigating it. But there does come to a point where they have conducted all reasonable measures to mitigate that risk. You can't make it perfectly safe, you can't close it down. And I think that depends on the sector and the value of the data contained by the sector. But it absolutely must be a discussion in the board. In defence, we had 10 risks that the Chief of Defence Staff took. 2 of them were cyber related. That's kind of how seriously we were taking it. And I think that it would be really interesting to see if the risk register on the FTSE 100 A, had cyber risks on there, and B, whether they're intelligible to the CFO as opposed to the CIO. So I guess my summary is we don't have the vehicles to create cyber justice. Therefore, boards have got to look after themselves in this kind of Wild West environment. And the only way to do that is to be really, really clear and engaged in the risk management process.
I agree. Many of the breaches that we've seen have involved weak links, including through the use of consultants and obtaining access to a system through a third party or a consultant. JP Morgan, the breach there, Target that's been mentioned already, the Home Depot one in the States as well. All weak links, third party contractors. But as John says, it's a board responsibility. In most civil and regulatory environments, the liability doesn't attach absolutely, and in relation to a breach or a loss of data, it encompasses ideas of due diligence and reasonable efforts. They're not often, certainly in this country, effectively strict liability offences.
Well, that's good to know, isn't it? Gentleman in the front.
Going back to your, and largely the same topic as the previous question, going back to your analogy about the bank robber and culpability, rather than personal data, investment banks, PR firms, law firms, so on, hold tons of market-sensitive data, often in rather insecure environments, e.g., someone reviewing a profit warning on the train over the Wi-Fi or something like that. Is there a scenario where said intermediary can be held culpable for market manipulation that arises from somebody effectively being the bank robber and stealing that data and using it in a nefarious way?
Sounds like a legal question, Jason.
Yes. Yeah, I can see that. It depends what you mean by held liable. I doubt regulatory or criminal liability, which tend to have intention sitting behind them.
But for not protecting the data.
Yes, I could certainly see in a case of recklessness regulatory intervention. Yes.
I think in terms of personal responsibility, from an ethical and moral perspective, I think we're going to see a change of tide over the coming years. So if you think, we've talked about the corporate's liability, which is quite plain to see, and we're already seeing now in SLAs with suppliers, major corporations making some of that liability contractual with suppliers in terms of data protection, which is great, indeed, in being indemnified, which is of course fundamental. But of course, you've then got individuals and their behaviour, and of course, individuals as employees don't tend to be liable for very much. But I think that tide is going to change in terms of what is acceptable behaviour. When I see a friend post on social media the fact that they're on holiday and away, and I think they're mad. I mean, I think it's just unbelievable. I want to go and burgle their house when I see that. Exactly. It's all in the interest of education. But when friends post pictures of their children online in a central London location, I go berserk. But I'm in the minority. But I think as more and more of these threats and risks become public knowledge and people actually think about it, we touched earlier on, teenage children and their use of social media in passing. And I find that really interesting that we've got this kind of lost generation in the middle who've spent the last 10, 15 years documenting their lives online. What I find fascinating is that when we go and talk to the teenage children of an ultra-high net worth family about use of social media and some of the risks that are exposed by the content they put out there, family risk, security, physical security, cybersecurity or you know, reputational risks. You know, what the pesky journalist might pick up when they come under scrutiny, what the attacker might pick up, the fact that, you know, their content has disclosed the kind of next port of arrival of the family super yacht, whatever it might be. When we talk to teenage children about that stuff, they always inevitably start with a "this is a waste of my time" attitude. But without exception, by the end of it, what's interesting is, of course, these people have grown up using this technology. So in terms of the channels, the mediums and the tools, they understand them very, very well. Now, it's hardly surprising that a teenager isn't thinking about risk naturally by default, because they don't in other ways either. What's fascinating is when we talk to them about that stuff, they are the fastest people, faster than our FTSE clients. They're the fastest people to go, "Oh my God," and to shut it all down, you know, and to really think. So I think the tide will change. I think we're seeing now, even in schools, more slowly than I'd like it to be done, we're seeing people being educated on these kind of risks, but it's slow. And I worry there'll be this kind of generation in the middle who've kind of fully exposed themselves and won't be able to take all of it back.
So if the principal company is responsible for that data on behalf of its clients or its shareholders and stakeholders, then I would say it's got a duty to look after that. And the vehicles that it's got to look after that is a strong HR policy, which would mean that an inappropriate use, say, of something like that on a train would be counter to the contract, and you could get them under the contract. Of course, all we do is read the terms of conditions. We do our annual cyber training, tick, 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 and job done. So you need to be better than that, but you can go back down range at people that way. And another way of looking at it is whichever audit you choose to do in cyber, and there are far too many blooming audits to choose, they all talk about managing boundary and about managing third parties. So making sure that there is a contractual statement with your third parties and a sharing with your third parties to safeguard that data means, again, you've got a slightly bigger legal stick to beat them with. Now, and having done that, if that client, that consultant, whatever, loses your data, then you can say we've done it, and it's your reputation that's protected. And again, it's very surprising how the CIO is hanging on to the cyber problem and doesn't talk to counsel about how you're going to write contracts to ensure that you've got the wherewithal to do that. And if I could bridge to one single message, is this is a board responsibility with all the responsibilities, all the leverages and all the disciplines of the board. It's not just IT. And too often that doesn't happen.
I just wanted to respond to your comment about annual review of data protection, your annual do everyone's training. I work in a company where data is our most precious asset, and I would be astonished, absolutely astonished, if anybody in the company didn't realise it was a sackable offence to open a confidential document on a tube. Absolutely, and indeed any company supplier didn't understand that was absolutely contractually fatal. And the idea of training your staff annually simply isn't enough.
It's not good.
You absolutely have to train on a very regular basis every single person in the company, from the very top to the very bottom, to show that you're taking it seriously, and make it completely clear that if they don't pass their data security training and understand the risk, that's it. That's a barrier to success. And I just think, if we're even talking about the risk of somebody opening a confidential document on the tube, that company's not quite in the right place.
Couldn't agree more. Best practice, and I think the investment in something like that is a drop in the ocean compared to the investment in the technology that other people do. So it's kind of a given that that's where the emphasis and the return should be.
It's more of an ironic observation than a question, actually. I'm almost as paranoid as Dave on security, and I'm intrigued because I would have come to this seminar expecting it to be Chatham House, and yet we have a live Twitter feed and people taking our photos.
It's a very good point.
So, okay, so let me comment on that. So my picture wasn't on the internet until 4 months ago, and so I've gone through a really interesting Damascene moment in doing this. I think, and
it's on there quite a lot from this morning.
It is rather, yeah. And you probably know, so I'm being very careful about what I say. I think the education is more important than security, and I think as long as we can share within the boundaries and get the education out, that's a cool thing. It might be that there's room for a more closed down Chatham House grouping to delve into the greater detail. But yeah, it's quite interesting going from the paranoia of the security services to sharing like that.
Yeah. This is a sham front end. We've hacked the back end and deleted all the pictures.
Let's switch it off.
Yeah.
I'm slightly worried about saying anything now. I suppose I should just take it back. There was a question earlier on about whether we're going to see any more class actions as a result of security breaches. It's probably worth putting a bit more flesh on the bones of that. So the reason we haven't seen very much of that to date is that under the Data Protection Act as it stands, it's not possible to claim damages for mere distress. You've got to show some other form of financial loss, and that is quite a legal hot potato, and the Supreme Court will rule on that topic at some point next year. But if we fast forward at some point in the next 12, 18 months, we'll have something called the General Data Protection Regulation, and that's going to change the landscape pretty significantly. First of all, the UK position that you can't get damages for mere distress is bound to go under the General Data Protection Regulation, so we can expect a more intensive claims environment. But the other very significant point is that someone said most of these hacks people don't know about, and that's because there is no mandatory reporting obligation under our regime at the moment in relation to breaches of the data protection regime. Contrast that, for example, with the banking regulatory environment, where there's much more of an obligation to go and tell the regulator that something's happened and this is what you're doing about it. Again, under the GDPR, that just won't be the position, and so the default position will be that you will need to report situations where you have been subject to some sort of security breach, and so keeping a lid on this, 5 years' time, that's just not going to happen.
That's quite
Not
right.
really a question, more of an observation.
Yes, exactly. And I think the Information Commissioner, has already said how he's going to respond to the GDPR in terms of reporting, i.e. what he's going to do with the information. So it's not just company to regulator stop, it's company, regulator, public.
Yeah.
Right, well, I'd like to thank our speakers for a fascinating session, if not rather worrying. So I think all of us, if you go back to your offices, maybe the first thing to do is ring the CEO and ask what the policy is and what they're doing, and you know, are they taking this seriously? Because I think we should all take it very seriously, and let's all pledge not to open documents on the train anymore. Thank you all very much.